Welcome back, episode 15.2, still discussing how to market stop loss, but 15.2 is going to focus on what if you engaged a TPA to market your stop loss instead of a GA, okay? So TPA, what is a TPA? For those of you who don't know, a TPA is a third-party administrator. They are the entity that manages your claims, adjudicates those claims, processes, make sure they're paid appropriately, on time, giving you reporting. They're basically, I've heard the term connective tissue of your self-funded plan, okay? So the third-party administrator is your TPA, is your claims payer, etc. They also, just like the GAs in the previous video 15.1, they do not assume any of the stop loss risk. There are some TPAs that are owned by carriers that have their own third-party stop loss carrier. That third-party stop loss carrier would have a separate name, should be a separate business altogether. So yes, they would take the stop loss risk, but the TPA themselves is not taking the stop loss risk either. And of course, they are also compensated for some sort of fee, right? They're going to get their administrative fees for processing the claims, but they might also get some sort of override or payment for helping you place the stop loss at the same time, okay? So they could double dip. We'll talk about if that's a con. So what are some pros? Again, they might, and I have this little arrow here, they might provide you broader market access than you currently have with your own direct relationships. But one big caveat, which we'll talk about that in a second, they may not have as broad of a market access, and there's a limitation if they're doing the stop loss, okay? So coordination, this is one of the biggest pros in my opinion. If they are your TPA, whether they're prospecting or they're currently your TPA, and they're doing your stop loss marketing as well, they're going to be marketing to stop loss carriers that have them approved, have them vetted as a TPA, and therefore there's going to be coordination, sort of synergy or congruence between when they place the stop loss and with them as a TPA, so you have that assurance that those things are going to work in conjunction appropriately. Again, they might bring better leverage, right? Some of the bigger TPAs or maybe the carrier-owned TPAs that are semi-independent have a lot broader leverage in the marketplace. They very likely have bigger blocks of business with these carriers than you do, and therefore, they can tip the scales a little bit in their favor versus maybe if you're doing it on your own. Okay? And again, ease and time, I don't want to repeat myself from the GA video, but there is the potential for, you offload this to them, you outsource this to them. They, of course, will do it for you, hopefully provide some time savings as well, depending on how busy they are and their volume of RFPs. But that is another obvious pro of you not doing it yourself. Okay? Cons. All right. Again, objective, right? Not saying this is better or worse or this is the way you should do it, but the most obvious con is if they go to market stop loss, they're only going to market stop loss with the assumption that they are going to be the TPA, okay? So if you're vetting other TPAs at the same time during your RFP and you go to, let's say, UMR versus Meritain or both, they're going to provide you stop loss quotes assuming them as the TPA. So let's say you let one TPA market your stop loss and you don't end up going with that TPA as the administrator, well, those stop loss quotes are effectively null and void. You will have to go now, seek those stop loss carriers out directly, tell them what your TPA and network combination is actually going to be. They'll have to revise their bid. It might take some time, but this is the most obvious con, and this is why I actually think the market is potentially moving away from the TPAs as being the default marketer of stop loss as brokers become more averse in this, or as GAs become more prevalent. Plan side again is also potentially a solution. But the TPA, I'm seeing less and less stop loss being marketed and placed by the TPA, and this is one of the more obvious limitations of that. Not saying they're bad by any means, but consider this. If you don't place your business with that TPA, the stop loss quotes that they brought to you won't be usable. Okay? Loss of control, again, outsourcing kind of the same thing, ties in with this as well, that limitation. So loss of control is a potential. Now I have this line here as a pro for market access, but also potentially a con, okay? Really depends on your individual circumstances as a producer or your agency circumstances. If you personally don't have that great of market access, then that TPA is probably going to bring more markets to you. However, if you have 10 to 12 carriers that you typically do business with, and maybe they have a similar set or maybe slight overlap and maybe some deviation, but again, they're only going to market to stop loss carriers that have approved them as a TPA, right? So if they are a newer TPA with less sort of history in the marketplace and less data for those carriers to review, some carriers may not even have them approved as a TPA, and therefore, again, the approach for that carrier is basically moot, okay? This is another one that I think is why the industry is potentially moving away from TPAs as being as prevalent as the marketers of stop losses, because just because they're great at self-funding, they understand claims processing, they understand coordinating a PBM and a stop loss carrier in terms of billing and integration, it doesn't mean they know everything about stop loss. I think as I've discovered in talking to people in the marketplace, one of the reasons I'm doing these videos is there isn't a lot of people that truly understand stop loss all that well. So the presumption that just because a TPA understands self-funding doesn't mean they actually are experts in stop loss, right? Just like a stop loss carrier is not necessarily an expert in claims administration. So be very careful. Just because you think they may know exactly what they're doing, and they could, okay, again, caveat it, they certainly could, but the default assumption that they do know stop loss, maybe even better than your team, I think is again, a reason why this is becoming less of a prevalent way for stop loss to be marketed. So you may have great TPAs, great TPA relationships, certainly want to be as objective as possible, but these are things in my experience that I've seen as potential downsides for using them to be your distribution channel for stop loss. Okay, so episode 15.2, obviously you know where we're going next, direct marketing by brokers, but this is a general overview of what a TPA is, how they get involved in the stop loss marketing process, and the relevant pros and cons of using this channel. Thanks again, guys. Talk to you soon.